What if I told you there's a 1.6-liter engine that makes more power than a Bugatti Veyron? Not 500 horsepower, not 750. We're talking about over 1,000 horsepower from an engine smaller than what's in your neighbor's Honda Civic. This isn't some theoretical laboratory experiment or a one-off dyno queen that explodes after 30 seconds. These engines ran full race distances, survived qualification sessions that would melt ordinary motors, and dominated the most prestigious racing series on the planet. They rewrote the laws of what was possible from forced induction, turned conventional wisdom on its head, and did it all through a loophole so brilliant that when regulators finally understood what was happening, it was already too late. Picture this. It's 1977, and Formula One is in crisis. The cars have become too fast, too dangerous. Jackie Stewart's safety crusade is gaining momentum after too many drivers have died. The governing body, desperate to slow things down, announces new regulations for the upcoming seasons. Among the changes buried in subsection 5.1.4 is an equivalency formula that seems reasonable enough. Naturally aspirated engines can run up to 3.0 liters. Turbocharged engines, to compensate for their forced induction advantage, are limited to just 1.5 liters. The math seemed simple to the rulemakers. A turbo running modest boost should equal a larger naturally aspirated engine. What could possibly go wrong? And this is the story of how engineers turned a rule meant to restrict them into the most powerful engines Formula One has ever seen, how a displacement disadvantage became the ultimate advantage, and why even today, 40 years later, no racing series has dared to allow unrestricted turbo development again. Notch 10, to understand why this loophole changed everything, we need to travel back to the early 1970s. Formula One was dominated by Ford's Cosworth DFV, a naturally aspirated 3.0-liter V8 that produced around 470 horsepower. It was reliable, relatively affordable, and available to any team willing to write a check. Lotus, McLaren, Tyrrell, March, Williams, they all ran the DFV. It was the great equalizer, which meant racing was decided more by chassis design and driver skill than engine superiority. Ferrari ran their own flat 12, but it wasn't significantly more powerful. The horsepower wars had reached a plateau. Netiast and the turbocharging equivalency rule had actually existed since 1966, but nobody took it seriously. Why would you? Turbo technology in the 70s was crude. Turbo lag was measured in geological time. The heat management problems seemed insurmountable. The complexity added weight and packaging nightmares. Renault was the only manufacturer naive enough to try, and when they showed up to the 1977 British Grand Prix with their yellow RS Ura 1 powered by a 1.5-liter turbocharged V6, the paddock laughed. The British press nicknamed it Rhea, the yellow teapot, Wim, because it whistled and steamed constantly. It qualified 17th and retired after 16 laps with turbo failure. Shenzhen. But Renault's engineers weren't stupid. They were playing a longer game. While everyone else was squeezing the last few horsepower from naturally aspirated engines that had reached their development ceiling, Renault was exploring virgin territory. Their engine, designated the EF1, started at 510 horsepower, already more than the Cosworth DFV, despite giving away half the displacement. The key was boost pressure. The rules said nothing about limiting boost, nothing at all. And here's where the engineering gets beautiful. A naturally aspirated engine is limited by atmospheric pressure, about 14.7 psi at sea level. That's all the air pressure available to push the fuel-air mixture into the cylinders. But a turbocharger is essentially an air compressor powered by exhaust gases. The hot exhaust spins a turbine at speeds up to 150,000 RPM. That turbine is connected by a shaft to a compressor wheel that forces air into the engine. Run 15 psi of boost, and you've doubled the air pressure. Double the air means double the fuel, which means roughly double the power. In theory, in practice, it's much more complicated. Compressing air generates heat through the ideal gas law. More pressure equals more temperature. The temperature rises so dramatically that the air entering the engine can exceed 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot air is less dense than cool air, which reduces power. Worse, it causes detonation, premature ignition that can destroy an engine in seconds. The pistons, connecting rods, and crankshaft need to be strong enough to handle double or triple the force they were designed for. The cooling system needs to dissipate heat that would melt a conventional engine. The fuel system needs to deliver massive quantities of fuel precisely metered to prevent running lean and melting pistons. Janssen Renault solved these problems one by one. They developed sophisticated intercoolers, essentially radiators for compressed air, that dropped intake temperatures by over 200 degrees. They switched from conventional gasoline to toluene-based fuel mixtures that could resist detonation at extreme pressures. They forged their engine internals from exotic materials. Pistons were made from aerospace aluminum alloys. Connecting rods were forged from titanium. The crankshaft was machined from a solid billet of steel that cost more than most complete engines. By 1979, Renault won their first Grand Prix at Dijon. The paddock stopped laughing. By 1980, the EF1 was producing 520 horsepower in race trim, then 540, then 560. Ferrari took notice and began developing their own 1.5-liter turbo V6. BMW joined the party with a four-cylinder based on their production M10 block, the same basic engine from a 320i street car. Hart, Alfa Romeo, and Honda would follow. The turbo era had begun, but nobody anticipated what would happen when these manufacturers started pushing boost levels beyond anything the rule makers imagined. The regulations had created a perfect storm. There were no boost limits, no fuel flow restrictions, no limits on exotic fuels. The only constraint was the 220-liter fuel tank capacity for race distance, but even that became irrelevant in qualifying where special engines could run for just a few laps. The numbers started climbing at a rate that defied belief. BMW's M1213 four-cylinder, developed by Paul Roche, became the first to crack 700 horsepower in 1982. They achieved this by running boost pressures that would terrify modern engineers. In qualifying trim, they pushed 50 psi of boost. To put that in perspective, a modern high-performance road car turbo runs maybe 20 psi. The BMW engine was cramming 3.5 times atmospheric pressure into its cylinders. The stress on components was unimaginable. Cylinder pressures exceeded 200 bar, that's 2,900 psi. The combustion forces were so violent that BMW had to develop special acoustic sensors to detect the onset of detonation before it destroyed the engine. The turbocharger itself glowed cherry red, radiating heat that warped surrounding components. Mechanics needed asbestos gloves just to work near the engine after a run. The exhaust manifolds regularly cracked from thermal cycling. Turbos failed so frequently that teams carried a dozen spares to each race. And then Honda entered Formula One in 1983 with their RA163E V6, and they brought Japanese manufacturing precision to the turbo wars. While European manufacturers were essentially building grenades designed to survive just long enough, Honda focused on reliability through metallurgy. They developed their own aluminum alloy with copper and magnesium that could withstand higher temperatures. Their connecting rods used a special steel with molybdenum that maintained strength at extreme temperatures. They pioneered ceramic coatings for pistons that acted as thermal barriers. The real breakthrough came in fuel chemistry. The rules specified only that fuel must be petroleum-based with no more than 2% alcohol. Within those broad parameters, teams concocted witches' brews that bore no resemblance to pump gas. Honda's fuel contained 84% toluene, a component normally used in paint thinner and TNT. BMW went even further with a mixture that was essentially rocket fuel. It required special handling procedures. Mechanics wore respirators. A single spark could cause an explosion. The fuel was so volatile it had to be cooled to near freezing before being pumped into the car. By 1985, the horsepower numbers had become surreal. BMW's M1213 in qualifying trim was producing over 900 horsepower, but that wasn't the limit. For the 1986 Italian Grand Prix at Monza, a circuit that rewards pure power, BMW prepared a special qualifying engine. They fitted a larger turbocharger, removed all restrictions, and mixed a fuel blend that was 86% toluene with aromatics that pushed the octane rating above 120. The boost gauge went past 70 psi before the needle stopped. Nobody knows the exact power output because BMW's dynamometer couldn't measure it. Estimates ranged from 1,300 to 1,500 horsepower, from 1.5 liters. 4 cylinders, and let that sink in for a moment. A modern Formula One engine with all of today's technology, hybrid systems, and unlimited budgets produces about 850 horsepower from the combustion engine alone. These turbo monsters from the 80s, using technology that seems primitive by comparison, made nearly double that. The specific output was over 900 horsepower per liter. The most powerful production car engines today barely crack 200 horsepower per liter. The Honda RA166E became the first to officially break 1,000 horsepower on Honda's own dynamometer. They achieved this through a combination of extreme boost and revolutionary engine management. While other teams used mechanical fuel injection with crude boost controllers, Honda developed a fully digital engine control unit. It could adjust ignition timing and fuel delivery 1,000 times per second, dancing on the edge of detonation without crossing over. The engine ran so close to its limits that Honda engineers programmed in a H-sacrifice mod, a button that would extract maximum power for one flying lap, after which the engine would need rebuilding. And these qualifying engines were exactly that, built specifically for qualifying. They'd warm up, do 1 or 2 flying laps, then be removed and torn down. Pistons showed heat damage that looked like they'd been hit with a cutting torch. Valve seats were hammered so badly they'd need replacing. Bearings showed wear that would normally take 100,000 miles to accumulate. The engines literally consumed themselves for those few seconds of ultimate performance. Teams would go through 3 or 4 engines just in Saturday qualifying, and the racing engines were detuned significantly but still produced shocking power. Nelson Piquet's 1987 Williams Honda FW11B made 685 horsepower in race trim running only 35 psi of boost. That was still 200 horsepower more than the best naturally aspirated engines. The acceleration was so violent that drivers complained of tunnel vision under acceleration. They'd black out momentarily in fast corners from the G-forces. Gerhard Berger described driving the Ferrari F187 as ashras, like being kicked in the back by a horse every time you touch the throttle. The technological spillover was immediate and significant. Every major manufacturer involved in Turbo Formula One applied their learning to production cars. The Porsche 959 used technology developed for their TAG Formula One engine. BMW's M-Power division was born from their turbo program. Honda's VTEC system grew from their need to optimize valve timing for different boost levels. Ferrari's F40, with its twin-turbo V8 making 478 horsepower, was directly influenced by their Formula One program. Even today, the Mercedes-AMG 1 hypercar uses a detuned version of their Formula One turbo hybrid system, and it still can't match the specific output those 80s turbo engines achieved. The drivers of this era deserve special recognition. They were wrestling with power delivery that was anything but linear. Turbo lag meant you'd mat the throttle mid-corner and nothing would happen for a full second. Then suddenly, 900 horsepower would arrive like a sledgehammer. The cars would literally jump sideways. Ayrton Senna, arguably the greatest driver ever, described his Lotus 98T as almost undrivable in the wet. The boost threshold was so sudden that the rear wheels would instantly overwhelm their traction limit. There was no progressive power delivery, no finesse possible. It was either no power or all the power, with nothing in between. The safety implications were terrifying. These were still 80s Formula One cars with aluminum monocoques that would fold like origami in a serious impact. No power steering. Manual gearboxes that required taking a hand off the wheel to shift while managing 1,000 horsepower. Carbon brakes were just being introduced and couldn't always cope with the speeds these engines enabled. The Brabham BT55, designed to house BMW's tilted four-cylinder turbo, was so difficult to drive that Riccardo Patrese said it had tried to kill me every lap. And fuel management became a dark art. The 220-liter tank limit meant drivers had to constantly adjust their boost to conserve fuel. Too aggressive early in the race, and you'd run dry with 10 laps to go. Too conservative, and you'd finish with fuel in the tank and positions lost. Dash displays showed fuel consumption in real time, but calculation errors were common. Multiple races saw leaders run out of fuel in sight of the checkered flag. The 1985 San Marino Grand Prix saw both Stefan Johansson's Ferrari and Andrea de Cesaris's Ligier run dry on the final lap while running in the points. The costs were astronomical. Honda reportedly spent over $100 million per year on their engine program in 1980s dollars. That's nearly $300 million adjusted for inflation. Each qualifying engine cost approximately $150,000 to build and lasted less than 10 minutes. Teams were burning through 30 engines per car per season. The exotic materials, specialized fuel, and army of engineers required budgets that only manufacturer teams could afford. The privateer teams running customer Cosworth DFVs were literally lapped in qualifying. The gap between the haves and have-nots had never been wider. And by 1986, the situation had become untenable. Speeds at circuits like Monza were approaching 220 miles per hour on the straights. The closing speeds between turbo and naturally aspirated cars were dangerous. FISA, Formula One's governing body, announced that turbos would be banned after 1988. For those final 2 seasons, they introduced boost restrictions. 4.0 bar absolute in 1987, reduced to 2.5 bar in 1988. Fuel capacity was slashed to 150 liters. Pop-off valves were mandated to prevent teams from exceeding boost limits. And even with restrictions, the engines remained devastatingly powerful. Honda's RA168E, despite running just 36 psi of boost instead of the previous 70+, still made 685 horsepower and powered McLaren to 15 wins in 16 races in 1988. It remains the most dominant season in Formula One history. The engine was so superior that Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost lapped the entire field in multiple races. At the British Grand Prix, they finished over a minute ahead of third place. The ban took effect in 1989, ending the turbo era officially. But the technological legacy continued. The development of advanced materials, precision manufacturing, engine management systems, and forced induction technology accelerated automotive development by decades. Every modern turbocharged road car owes something to those Formula One engines. The Nissan GT-R's twin-turbo V6, the Mercedes-AMG 2.0-liter four-cylinder making 416 horsepower, the Koenigsegg Gemera's 600-horsepower three-cylinder, they all trace their DNA back to that loophole in the 1977 regulations. What made this era unique wasn't just the power figures, though those remain unmatched in Formula One history. It was the perfect storm of factors that allowed it to happen. Vague regulations that nobody anticipated would be pushed so far. Manufacturer involvement with essentially unlimited budgets. fuel companies willing to create exotic brews that bordered on explosive, engineers given free rein to explore the absolute limits of internal combustion, and drivers brave or crazy enough to wrestle these monsters around a racetrack at speeds that still seem impossible today. The modern Formula One engine formula, introduced in 2014, includes hybrid technology that boosts total system power to around 1,000 horsepower. But the combustion engine itself is limited to approximately 850 horsepower. Fuel flow is restricted to 100 kilograms per hour. Every parameter is monitored and regulated. The FIA learned their lesson. They'll never again leave a loophole that allows engineers to pursue maximum power without restriction. Consider what those engineers achieved with 1980s technology. No computational fluid dynamics, no advanced simulation software. Materials science that was primitive compared to today. They used slide rules and intuition, where modern engineers have supercomputers and finite element analysis. Yet they extracted specific outputs that modern engines can't match. The BMW M1213's estimated 900-plus horsepower per liter remains the highest specific output of any racing engine ever built. Modern NASCAR engines make about 140 horsepower per liter. IndyCar engines produce around 230 horsepower per liter. Even Formula One's current hybrid-era engines achieve only about 280 horsepower per liter from the combustion unit alone. The rulemaker's fundamental mistake was underestimating human ingenuity. They saw turbocharging as a modest performance enhancer, maybe worth 20 or 30% more power. They never imagined engineers would run boost pressures that turned the intake manifold into a pressure vessel, use fuel that was barely legal as gasoline, or build engines designed to survive just long enough to complete a qualifying lap. The equivalency formula assumed rational development. What they got was an arms race that pushed the boundaries of physics. The stories from mechanics of that era are legendary. Engines that would hydraulic lock from fuel pooling in the cylinders if they sat too long. Turbochargers that glowed so bright you could read by their light. Exhaust pipes that would turn blue, then white, then transparent as the metal crystallized from heat cycling. One Honda mechanic described warming up an RA160C for qualifying. Then the engine bay would shimmer like a desert mirage. Metal parts would expand so much we had to account for it in our suspension settings. The heat coming off that engine could blister paint on cars parked nearby. The driver's physical conditioning had to evolve to handle these machines. The acceleration was so severe it could cause breathing difficulties as the G-forces compressed their chests. Neck muscles had to support heads that effectively weighed 5 times normal under cornering loads amplified by the extra speed these engines provided. Martin Brundle, who drove the Zaxpeed 861 with its inline-4 turbo, said his vision would gray out under acceleration. You'd come out of a slow corner, floor it, and for a moment everything would go dim as the blood drained from your head. Then the turbo would hit properly, and you'd better be pointing straight, because the car would go sideways faster than you could correct. The speed of development was staggering. In 1983, the pole position time at Monaco was 1:24.840, set by Alain Prost in a Renault RE40, making about 650 horsepower in qualifying trim. By 1985, Ayrton Senna's Lotus 97T, powered by a Renault EF15, making over 900 horsepower, dropped that to 120/450. Same circuit, same regulations, but 2 seconds faster in just 2 years. At high-speed circuits like Silverstone and Monza, the gains were even more dramatic. The 1986 British Grand Prix saw Piquet qualify at an average speed of 160.938 mph. The previous year it had been 160.14 mph. Wait, that seems similar? Here's the kicker. 1986 was run on a different, significantly longer circuit layout. On the same track, he would have been 4 seconds faster. Why, now, the fuel consumption figures were equally absurd. At maximum power, these engines consumed fuel at a rate that would empty a road car's tank in less than 15 minutes. The Honda RA1666E at full boost burned through 1.2 gallons per minute. That's 72 gallons per hour. The engine was literally converting fuel to horsepower at a rate that required special high-flow fuel pumps originally designed for aircraft. The injectors, operating at pressures over 150 psi, sounded like machine guns firing. The fuel rail had to be machined from solid billet to withstand the pressure without flexing. And since the engineering solutions were often ingenious, BMW discovered that their blocks were stronger if they started with used engines from road cars. The thermal cycling from street use would stress relieve the aluminum, making it more stable under extreme boost. They would buy old 320Ti engines from junkyards, strip them down, and rebuild them into Formula One motors. A block that started life puttering around Munich at 90 horsepower would end up screaming to 11,000 RPM, making 15 times that power. Ausen and Honda's approach to piston cooling was revolutionary. They developed a system that sprayed oil directly at the underside of the pistons through jets aimed precisely at the hottest points. But the oil would break down under the extreme temperatures, so they used a synthetic formula that cost $300 per gallon. Each engine used 4 gallons. That's $100 to $200 in oil alone, burned up in a few laps of qualifying. The turbochargers themselves were technological marvels. KKK, Garrett, and IHI pushed the boundaries of what was possible with rotating assemblies. The turbine wheels were made from Inconel, a nickel-chromium superalloy that could withstand exhaust gas temperatures exceeding 1,050 degrees Celsius. The shafts were supported by ball bearings running an oil fed at 100 psi to handle the 180,000 RPM rotational speeds. The compressor wheels were forged from aerospace aluminum alloys and balanced to tolerances measured in fractions of a gram. A single turbocharger cost more than most complete racing engines from the naturally aspirated era. Nenshin. The sound these engines made was unlike anything before or since. The naturally aspirated engines of the era produced the classic Formula One wail. The turbos were different. At idle, they burbled and popped like a badly tuned tractor. Under acceleration, the turbo whistle would rise in pitch until it became a shriek that could damage hearing even through helmets and earplugs. At full boost, the engines produced a sound that witnesses described as harsh, tearing fabric, or nanch, ripping metal. The Honda V6 had a particularly distinctive sound, a combination of intake howl, turbo whistle, and exhaust note that created harmonics you could feel in your chest from the grandstands. Enhanced telemetry from the era, primitive as it was, showed the violence of the power delivery. Graphs of wheel speed versus engine speed revealed constant spikes where the rear wheels would break traction, spin up to sometimes double the speed they should be traveling, then hook up again. This happened multiple times per second. The drivers were essentially conducting 1,000 tiny drag races, constantly catching and correcting slides that would happen too fast for conscious thought. It was all reflexes and instinct. The psychological impact on drivers was significant. Several retired rather than continue wrestling with the turbos. Niki Lauda, who won championships with both naturally aspirated and turbo cars, said the turbos' runs made you question your sanity every lap. The cars were so fast, so brutal, that they exceeded human ability to process information. Drivers reported making decisions based on memory rather than visual input because things were happening too quickly to consciously process. They'd brake for corners based on internal timing rather than visual markers, because by the time their brain registered what their eyes saw, it was already too late. Tatin. When the ban finally came, there was almost universal relief in the paddock. The engines had become too powerful, too expensive, too dangerous. The sport needed to reset. The 1989 season saw a return to naturally aspirated engines limited to 3.5 liters. Power dropped from 900 plus horsepower to around 650. Lap times increased by several seconds at every circuit. But the racing was closer, costs decreased, and smaller teams could compete again. Yet the ghost of the turbo era haunts Formula One even today. Every time someone proposes bringing back turbos without restrictions, the old-timers who remember share their war stories. The FIA's current hybrid turbo formula is so heavily restricted precisely because they know what happens when you let engineers chase maximum power. Boost pressure is limited. Fuel flow is limited. Development is frozen in many areas. They've learned that given any loophole, any ambiguity, engineers will exploit it to degrees that defy imagination. Entering the 1.6-liter turbo era of Formula One represents the absolute peak of internal combustion engine development. Never before or since have engineers been given such freedom to pursue power without restriction. Never again will we see engines that produce 900 horsepower per liter, that burn exotic fuels that border on explosive, that are designed to survive just long enough to complete a single flying lap. It was beautiful in its excess, terrifying in its execution, and ultimately unsustainable. But for those few years in the 1980s, engineers showed what was possible when the only limit was physics itself. They turned a rule meant to restrict them into an opportunity to redefine what an engine could do. They took 1.6 liters, less displacement than a modern economy car, and extracted power that hasn't been matched even with 40 years of additional development. They did it through creativity, determination, and a willingness to push into territory that others thought impossible. And that's the real lesson of the turbo era, not the horsepower figures or the lap times or even the spectacular failures. It's that given the opportunity, engineers will always find a way to exceed expectations. They'll take your restrictions and turn them into advantages. They'll find loopholes you never knew existed. They'll push materials, physics, and human endurance to limits you never imagined possible. And in doing so, they'll create something legendary. The next time you see a modern performance car boasting about its turbocharged engine making 400 or 500 horsepower, remember that 40 years ago, racing engineers were pulling more than double that from the same displacement, with carburetors and mechanical fuel injection, with metallurgy that seems primitive today, with cooling systems that were barely adequate. They did it because the rules accidentally let them, and once they started, pride and competition drove them to heights that still seem impossible today. What's the most impressive engine you've ever experienced? Drop a comment below and share your story. And if you want to hear more about the engineering marvels that push the boundaries of what's possible, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, keep those turbos spooling.